Oxford held silence like a sacred code. It wasn't the kind of silence that offered peace or stillness. It was heavier than that. It clung to the skin like humidity before a storm. Beneath the vaulted ceilings and stained glass, where the smell of ancient wood and damp stone curled together, there was an unspoken rule that some voices were meant to echo while others were meant to disappear. The university was not merely a school, it was a monument. And monuments, by their very nature, were built to honor certain names while quietly burying others. Inside the lecture hall, a room that had hosted presidents and poets, a quiet anticipation grew among the finely dressed attendees. There were students in tailored blazers with Oxford crests stitched into their sleeves. Professors who had published volumes of theory stacked like fortresses around their reputations. Scholars from across Europe and North America who specialized in international relations, post-colonialism, political theory. All of them had gathered for a 10-minute keynote address from a man who did not belong to their world, and yet threatened to redefine it. Ibrahim Traoré. He wasn't late. He wasn't early. He arrived with the stillness of someone who understood what it meant to walk into rooms not built for his presence. He wore no suit. Just a simple linen tunic, hands relaxed, eyes alert. The air shifted when he entered. Not because of grandeur or spectacle, but because of gravity. Because even silence bends toward truth when it walks into a room. At the back of the hall sat Professor Alistair Cromwell, whose very name carried academic weight like a cathedral bell. He had taught at Oxford for over 30 years. His textbooks were required reading in political science courses across 3 continents. He had written eloquently about the African continent from his desk in London, defining it with precision and distance. He had never lived there. He had visited only twice. But that had never stopped him from interpreting its revolutions, its rebellions, its grief. To him, Africa was a concept, a region, a case study. And on this day, he expected a young populist leader to walk in and confirm what he already believed. Ibrahim would offer passion, but not precision. Fire, but no foundation. A man carried by momentum, not method. Alistair had seen men like him before. At least that's what he told himself, but when Ibrahim reached the front of the room, he didn't perform, he didn't posture. He stood still, his eyes tracing each corner of the space, posing on faces the way one studies a map before choosing where to begin the journey. Then, with a voice that was neither loud nor strained, he spoke. I did not come here to be heard. I came here to be remembered. There was a stir among the audience. Some leaned forward, notebooks ready, pens uncapped. Others exchanged amused glances. Alistair remained unmoved, arms folded tightly across his chest, as if to keep his certainty intact. But the words that followed unspooled something no one expected. Ibrahim did not speak about policies. He did not recite statistics or make a diplomatic plea. He told a story of a small village where the sun rose before the birds, where children fetched water before school, where his mother once traded 2 eggs for a bar of soap. A story of a boy who lost his brother to a bullet meant for silence. He described the weight of poverty not as a theory, but as a muscle memory. He spoke of holding the hand of a teacher who bled out in a classroom, of watching a school blacken with smoke while textbooks curled into ash. He looked directly into the faces of professors who had spent careers writing about people like him, and said, "Some of you have written about us with such confidence, but we do not need your theories. We need your silence." The room fell still, not the stunned silence that precedes applause. The raw kind, the kind that has no map. Alistair blinked. His throat dried. He shifted in his seat but didn't know why. He felt the heat of his own heartbeat rising into his face. It wasn't just a rebuke, it was a reflection. He saw himself in the subtext. The man who had written chapters about revolutions he had never risked his life to join. The man who taught about oppression without having ever been oppressed. Ibrahim went on. He spoke about dignity, about reclaiming narratives, about the cost of being understood only through someone else's words. His voice did not waver. It did not plead. It declared that by the time he finished, the room was not waiting to clap. It was trying to breathe. Alistair sat motionless. Around him, people began to shift and rise, but he stayed. Frozen not by fear, but by realization. The kind that cracks everything. For years he had defined what mattered. Today he had been redefined. What he had witnessed in 10 minutes was not a speech. It was an unlearning, and he could feel it. In his hands, in his chest. In the silence that followed him out of that room and refused to leave. The next morning, Oxford was still Oxford. Its stones still whispered in Latin. The morning light still fell gently over the manicured quads, where the grass was trimmed with the kind of precision only centuries of tradition could demand. Bells rang out from towers as if nothing had changed. But something had. For one man, the world that had once seemed unshakable had begun to fracture quietly, inwardly. With every hour that passed, Alistair Cromwell sat alone in his office, wrapped in stillness that no longer comforted him. This was the same office where he had composed papers that would go on to win awards. The same mahogany desk where he had once signed letters of recommendation for students he admired. But now it looked less like a seat of knowledge and more like a museum of denial. Every book on his shelf, every framed certificate suddenly pulsed with a question he could no longer avoid. Had he ever really known the people he wrote about? Or had he only known how to name them? He couldn't bring himself to check his emails. There were dozens waiting, likely comments from students or colleagues about yesterday's speech. But what could they say that he hadn't already heard echoing? Inside him, Ibrahim's voice wasn't a sound anymore. It was a presence, a heavy thing sitting in the corners of the room. Unignorable, he tried to distract himself by opening an old lecture draft. His eyes scanned the words, polished and articulate. He had written about economic instability, civil unrest, democratic fragility, but now the sentences felt hollow. They were structured, yes, but lifeless. They said everything and nothing. They danced around suffering with elegance, but never touched it. He thought about what Ibrahim had said. The memory wasn't clean. It was jagged and alive. We do not need your theories. We need your silence. It hadn't been an insult. It had been an unveiling. Alistair looked at his reflection in the window. Behind him, the spines of books he had edited stood proud and imposing. Titles on African governance, conflict studies, regional diplomacy. He had taught an entire generation how to speak about pain from a distance. Now, all he could see was his own silence coming too late. He pulled open a drawer and found something that stopped him. A student essay, years old. Ibrahim's name at the top. He remembered it now. The boy who had submitted a thesis with fire in every paragraph. Alistair had dismissed it as ideological. Too raw, too political. He had covered the margins in red ink. Not objective, reframe this, cite properly. He had wanted Ibrahim to sound more academic, more acceptable, but reading it now, he saw what he had missed. It wasn't messy, it was urgent. It wasn't ideological. It was truth burning through the cracks of a broken language. He folded the paper slowly, placed it on the desk, and sat back in his chair as the weight of his own history pressed against his ribs. He didn't speak to anyone for 3 days. When he finally did leave his office, it wasn't for a lecture. It was to walk. No direction, no purpose. Just a quiet surrender to movement. He passed the old dining halls, the cloisters where students debated theory late into the night. He passed portraits of old scholars and heads of state. They looked like him. Men who had written the world into their own reflection. He found a bench beneath a willow tree by the river. It was there that the sentence returned to him. It wasn't spoken. It rose, soft and steady, from the stillness inside him. Let the wounded speak. He repeated it under his breath, once, then again. It didn't feel like an idea. It felt like an instruction. For the first time in his life, Alistair felt the need to be quiet, not out of politeness, but reverence. He returned home without checking his calendar. He let the emails pile up. He ignored the invitations to panels and conferences. He stopped preparing lectures altogether. Instead, he began to read differently, not as an expert, As a witness, he sought out stories from African journalists, diaries from war survivors, interviews with activists who had been jailed and beaten and still chose to speak. He watched footage of communities rebuilding themselves without Western aid. And every time he found himself wanting to critique or frame what he read, he stopped and listened. It was not enough to say he had been wrong. It was not enough to feel guilt. Guilt could be a disguise. He needed to understand what had been stolen by his certainty. So, if you are watching now and you have ever spoken over a story that wasn't yours, or explained someone else's truth before asking them for it, ask yourself what would happen if you made room instead. What would happen if we all stopped trying to explain the world and started hearing it scream? Comment below, let the wounded speak, because some truths are not meant to be translated. They are meant to be heard in their own voice. There are apologies that can be spoken. And then there are the ones that never find breath. The kind you carry quietly, folded deep inside the chest, where they press against the soul like letters unsent. Alistair Cromwell began writing those letters in the quiet hours before dawn. When the world was still and shame had no witnesses. It started as a compulsion. Something restless in his fingers, in his chest. Something that wouldn't let him sleep. So he sat at the desk in his study, the same desk where he had once built arguments like scaffolding around his ego, and began writing. Dear Mamadou. That was how the first letter began. Mamadou was a name he barely remembered, a child in a photograph attached to a grant proposal many years ago. The photo had shown a young boy, barefoot, standing outside the ruins of the school. There was a cracked chalkboard behind him and rubble at his feet. His eyes stared straight into the camera, not with sadness, but with a kind of stunned expectation. As if he was waiting to be understood, Alistair had used that photo in a keynote presentation. It had earned him applause. He wrote, "I used you. I reduced your existence to a metaphor. I never asked your name. I never wondered what happened to you after the photo was taken. I turned your pain into something useful for me. And for that, I am sorry." He folded the page and placed it in an envelope he did not seal. Then he wrote another and another. None of them addressed to people he actually knew. They were addressed to the ones he had spoken of but never spoken to. A young woman from Angola whose story he once cited without permission. A teacher who died during a protest in Zimbabwe, mentioned in passing in a chapter on civil resistance. A boy named Kasi who was described in one of his lectures as an example of post-conflict trauma, but who had never been given the dignity of a voice. Alistair wrote to them as if they were still alive. As if the act of naming them now, with honesty, could undo the erasure. But he knew it couldn't. These weren't letters of redemption. They were rituals of reckoning. He kept them all in a drawer by his bed. He never reread them. He never intended to send them. They were there because some truths needed to be written even if they would never be received. One afternoon, he opened his laptop and found an email forwarded by a former student. It was a link to a video. Ibrahim, once again, now standing in a modest classroom somewhere in Burkina Faso, surrounded by children scribbling on chalkboards, their voices soft but determined. In the video, Ibrahim said, "They told us our stories were too loud, too angry, too raw. But what they meant was that our stories were too real. We were never too loud. They were just too used to listening to themselves." Alistair closed the laptop and sat still for a long time. There was a tremor in his chest, but it wasn't grief anymore. It was clarity. Cold and sharp and necessary, he went to the old filing cabinet in the corner of his study. It was where he kept printed copies of every paper he had ever published. He pulled out one by one, reading the titles aloud, each one now sounding more like an echo than a declaration. Then carefully he placed them in a box, not to destroy them, but to put them away. Not as relics of success, but as reminders of. A man who had once confused articulation with authority, he no longer wanted to be the voice in the room. He wanted to be the space that made room for other voices. He began to attend public lectures from grassroots organizers. Not as a speaker, but as a listener. He sat in the back, took notes by hand and never introduced himself. He read African fiction, poetry, essays written from lived experience, stories he had once dismissed as anecdotal. And he felt his understanding shift with each paragraph. It wasn't an identity crisis. It was an identity correction. He no longer saw Africa as a subject. He saw it as a chorus that had never needed his voice in the first place. And if you are still watching, still walking through this story with me, ask yourself quietly, have I ever written someone else's pain into my own comfort? Then pause and comment below, let the wounded speak, because maybe, just maybe, this world begins to heal when the people who have been heard too much finally learn how to listen. There is a moment in some lives when the foundations begin to crack, not with thunder, but with silence. Not because someone shattered them, but because the person standing on them finally stopped pretending they were whole. For Alistair Cromwell, that moment didn't come in the form of confrontation. It came slowly, softly, like water seeping through a wall. It came as unlearning. He had spent decades constructing his intellectual cathedral, brick by brick, lecture by lecture. A carefully arranged structure of quotes, statistics, analysis, and elegant theories. He had been praised for his neutrality, admired for his precision. But now, neutrality felt like cowardice. Precision felt like distance. And every brick of knowledge he had once been proud of began to feel like a wall built to keep real voices out. He no longer stood in front of classrooms. He could not. The idea of returning to the podium made his stomach churn. Instead, he stayed. In the quiet places, the corners of libraries, the back rows of student forums. He started again, this time as a man with no need to be right. Only to be honest. One evening, long after the sun had faded into a cold blue dusk, he pulled out his doctoral thesis from a dusty shelf. It had won him his first university appointment. It had been celebrated as groundbreaking. Its title, once printed in journals across Europe, now read like a lie, reframing sub-Saharan political autonomy in post-colonial contexts. He opened the first page and began to read. The words stared back at him, smooth and confident, full of conclusions. But as he read them now, he saw something he had never seen before. The voices missing, the lives reduced. The sweeping claims he had made about places he had only glimpsed. Through the windows of a hotel. Every page felt heavier than the last. His hands trembled as he turned them. What once made him proud now made him ashamed. He had written about entire nations without understanding a single street corner. He had spoken of trauma with surgical detachment. He had theorized over suffering as if it were a language that belonged to him. By the end of the thesis, his eyes stung with tears he had refused to shed for too many years. He carried the manuscript out into the small garden behind his flat. The night air was still. The world was quiet. He knelt by a patch of damp earth, lit a small flame, and fed the pages into it one at a time. No speeches, no spectacle. Just a quiet act of letting go. He was not trying to erase the past. He was trying to stop worshiping it. That night, for the first time in his life, he slept without dreams. In the weeks that followed, he began to rebuild, but not himself. The world around him. He walked into spaces he would have once ignored. Community centers. Bookshops filled with stories he had never bothered to read. Lecture halls led by young African scholars who spoke with fire in their voice and truth on their tongues. At one such lecture, he sat in the back of a dimly lit room, watching a doctoral candidate from Nigeria dismantle the frameworks he had once built. She was precise, unapologetic, and brilliant. She challenged not only the content, but the structure of the field itself. When the presentation ended, the room erupted in applause. Alistair stayed seated. He waited until the crowd thinned. Out then approached her. Thank you, he said quietly. Not as a scholar. As a student, she smiled politely, not recognizing him. And he didn't offer his name. He didn't need to be known anymore. Only honest. At home, he removed every framed certificate from his study walls. In their place, he pinned quotes from the stories he now read nightly. Passages from prison letters, lines of poetry from resistance fighters, testimonies from women who had built schools out of ruins. One of them, written in charcoal across torn cardboard, read, "I do not need your help. I need you to get out of the way." He read it every morning. He no longer saw his role as a speaker. He saw it as a gatekeeper learning how to open the gate. Or better yet, step away from it altogether, and if you are still watching, still breathing. With this story, ask yourself, what would happen if we gave up being the expert and started being the student again? Say it again. Share it if you dare. Let the wounded speak, because power does not always need to be passed down. Sometimes it just needs to be stepped aside. Years had passed, but time, Alistair Cromwell had come to understand, did not heal everything. It only revealed what had always been broken. Oxford had returned to its rituals, its gowns and Latin mottos, its marble staircases that groaned under. Centuries of curated wisdom. The bells still rang every morning as they always had. Students still filled the dining halls with nervous ambition. Lecturers still debated ethics under the flicker of candlelight. But for Alistair, something inside had been fundamentally rearranged. He had become a stranger in a place that once bore his name like a medal. His old colleagues spoke of him now. In past tense, some said he had retired early. Others whispered of a breakdown. But Alistair wasn't broken. He was becoming whole, piece by piece, in the quiet places where no one applauded. His home had changed. Gone were the polished plaques and first edition books he once displayed like trophies. In their place were dog-eared journals from West African thinkers, self-published pamphlets from resistance leaders, newspaper clippings written by underground journalists risking everything for the truth. The walls of his study no longer held his name, they held stories. He lived above a Senegalese cafe now. The scent of roasted peanuts and spicy yassa chicken drifted through his window every evening. Some nights he sat near the back, listening to the rhythm of Wolof and French in conversations that rolled like songs across the small dining room. No one recognized him there. That anonymity felt like grace. He no longer taught in universities. Instead, he volunteered at a community center in East London. It served immigrant families, many from the very regions he had once lectured about without ever setting foot on their soil. He helped carry supplies, swept floors, set up folding chairs for evening classes. He read to children in the library on rainy afternoons. He never introduced himself with a title. When a boy once asked what he used to do, Alistair smiled and said, "I used to speak too much." And then he opened a book and listened as the boy tried to read his first full paragraph aloud. At home, he continued to write, not for journals, not for tenure. He wrote under a pen name that no one traced. Essays about the politics of listening, quiet reflections about systems and shadows. He submitted them to small community publications and local bulletins. He made no claims. He signed no bios. The words were no longer his legacy. They were his offering. One morning, a small envelope arrived by post, no return address, no stamp. He recognized just his name, handwritten with remarkable care. Inside was a single sentence in French, Vous avez enfancio mprs. You finally understand. There was no signature. But Alistair knew who it was from. Or rather, he knew who it was for. He sat in his chair, folded the letter, and wept. Not the sharp, violent weeping of shame, but the soft, redemptive kind. The kind that comes when a soul unclenches after many years of pretending to be whole. That evening he walked a long path past Oxford's lecture halls. He passed the old room where Ibrahim Traoré had once stood for 10 minutes and changed everything. The door was open. Inside, a group of students were rehearsing a presentation on decolonizing education. One of them stood and read aloud from a speech. "We are not stories written by others. We are the authors now." Alistair stood in the doorway. He did not enter. He did not make himself known. He simply listened, and in that moment he knew. The world had already begun to turn without him. And that was the point. The silence he had once feared had become his greatest contribution. Because sometimes the most powerful act of change is not to lead, but to step aside. He walked home, slowly, stopping to watch the light reflect on the windows of old buildings. He thought of all the rooms he had once tried to dominate. Now all he wanted was to make room. On the wall of his study, above his desk, hung a single piece of paper. Let the wounded speak. It was not a slogan. It was a reminder that he had once taken too much space, that now he lived to hold space for others. If this story has stirred something in you, if even a whisper of it lingers in your chest, then let it live there. Do not try to explain it. Do not rush to summarize it. Just carry it with care. And if you feel the courage, say it aloud. Let the wounded speak. Because sometimes what ruins a man's life is the only thing that ever sets him free.